the single responsibility principle, this should feel familiar. The single responsibility principle, or SRP, is the S in solid. And the goal is to think about how should we design the functionality of a particular class. And the reason I say it should feel familiar is that, when we've talked about functions, writing short methods, we want the idea, right, that a particular piece of code should try to do one thing. Our controller actions should be concise. The single responsibility principle takes that idea and applies it to the class as a whole. So what we say is a class should have one and only one reason to change. We can call this sort of each responsibility is sort of an axis of change, and that as we adapt our class over time, the changes in one class shouldn't affect others. Another way of putting this is that if I adapt my movie class to add some functionality, let's say displaying names in a certain way or doing something with the ratings, this change shouldn't interact with and affect other classes. What is the responsibility of a class in, let's say, less than 25 words? You should be able to write a description in a sort of short sentence or two about what the purpose of this class is. And this just helps you focus on why does this class exist compared to perhaps some other class. Models in our application have a sort of wide set of behaviors. They interact with the database. They handle things like validation. They can very easily start to handle things like presentation of content, interacting with other models. And so in particular with Rails, it's easy for a model to grow quite large. And so this is something to be aware of. Sometimes you get just a sinking feeling that a model is too large, but there's also tools that help us track that specifically. And so one of them is called lack of cohesion of methods. And LCOM comes in a few different flavors. The particular version that a lot of tools implement, called the Revise Henderson-Sellers method, but essentially it's a number between 0 and 1 that compares the number of instance methods, the number of instance variables, and how many times those instance variables are called in the class. So typically, there are some rules about this, which is we exclude trivial getters and setters, but essentially it's just, a sum and multiplication division to normalize a rough score of between 0 and 1. How cohesive is a particular class? And what you roughly want to see is that you have a fairly stable relationship between the number of instance methods and not too many instance variables, or that if you have certain things that are accessed way more frequently than other instance variables, that suggests that you might have a place to carve out a class into different ways. I will note, right, that because in Ruby and in our active record models, everything is a method, most applications that try and implement this in the Rails sense will look at an active record model and treat your columns in a database as instance variables. And that if you say movie.rating, we typically treat that, right, like an instance variable on another class, even though it is in reality a method. So the particular implementations of a score or a calculation can vary from project to project. There's another metric called LCOM4, which looks at the connected components in a graph, where related methods are connected by an edge. Essentially, what this does is if you were to draw out every single function in a class and draw out which functions rely on which other functions or which functions rely on instance variables, you could get a graph, the particular functions of, which is an edge and which direction things connect. We don't really need to get into. But the idea here is that if you were to draw out this entire class as a graph, you can look for connected components within a graph, or essentially places where this graph is in some way connected, but we could hopefully cleave off part of that graph into its own class. And the idea here is that the higher of an LCOM score, the more highly we have a suggestion that this class is doing too much, or it has more than one responsibility. That if we can take a set of instance methods and extract them to their own smaller class, that class would have its own high LCOM score, and our current class that's now smaller would also have its score increase. There's no one sort of metric that you could sort of pick for an application that says, above this threshold, we reject code. But the idea is methods which are not cohesive in general suggest that too many things are going on at once. And so in Ruby, and in particular with Rails, in the way that active record works, people can debate this all the time, which is, do active record models violate SRP? A lot of people would say that yes, in a way they do, because they seem to have a lot of behaviors in one particular class. Our movie class is not just responsible for managing the things about a movie, but it's responsible for knowing which movies, what other models movies relate to, knowing how to update the database, performing validations, and so on. And any particular business logic that exists goes in that same class. In practice, though, you can sort of debate in the weeds. Active Record implements a lot of these behaviors as modules, which compose classes together. So we'll talk about that. But really, it's about, I think, how you use your models in a Rails app. Going too far in any one direction isn't particularly helpful, but being aware that a class can get too large is a useful thing. So how might we think about extracting a class? In our Rails apps, we typically use relationships like has1 to denote that a moviegoer might be connected to other attributes. And if we had an address for a moviegoer, we could think about how we might extract that from our application. The tools here is that we can sort of ask, does it make sense to put a new database model in place? Does it make sense to just refactor our code? And so in this example, if we were to look at a particular class like a moviegoer, in this model, there are attributes for things that make up an address, so a street address, a phone number, a zip code, and so on. We could extract some of that logic into its own class, which we could call an address, and that class could perhaps belong to a moviegoer. That would remove some of the extra work. We could choose to have that class be its own database table, but it's also worth knowing that in Active Record, we don't have to have models backed by a database table. Rails gives us tools to do things like initialize a model, which is just a plain Ruby object from any sort of data, and that could live in our models folder. So we can compose classes together. We can delegate some of these behaviors to a new class. Maybe it does make sense for it to be its own database table. Maybe not. That depends on the particular use case. But we could sort of refactor the code into a more composable interface. Most applications with Ruby and with Rails in particular, I would say, have some kind of God object or an object that controls most of the behavior. It's hard to have an app that doesn't have a user class. And when we practice things like thin controllers, it's easy to move all of the business logic, all of the behaviors to a model. You start having methods in your model like, can a user do something, or does a user have permission to do X, Y, or Z, where you now have authorization logic in the model. And so one thing to do is to look for places where you can pull that logic out. You can make models in the models folder that don't depend on the database that exist in plain Ruby objects. And the other place to look for this is when you're working on code, look for how you test the application. If you start having to mock out object after object after object in long chains or a mock train wreck, this probably suggests that your model is too tightly coupled to other things, or that it has too many responsibilities that you might want to extract out into smaller classes. And doing so then makes it easier to create seams in your test cases that separate out that functionality.